At a mechanical level, the game doesn't have a way for the player to be precise with their aim. The game would have benefited a lot more to give the player the option to manually control the movement prediction system that the game has. So Armored Core recently came out with a new balance change, and I've been following the game Armored Core for a good amount of time now. I've been playing the game. I absolutely love the game, and I think it's a really interesting case of FromSoft coming out with a new title on of a genre that they've had for a long time, and then trying to innovate the title for a newer audience and for a newer time, because it's been 10 years since a new Armored Core game came out. And I think it's really interesting to see how they tried to adapt to the new climate in the video game world, and to the new company, because FromSoft is a much different company, and trying to adapt to customer expectations as well. And I think that's a really interesting topic that I kind of want to discuss in not just this video, but in general in multiple videos. Today I really want to talk about my general thoughts about Armored Core, and talk about the things that the game did well, but more importantly, critique the game and the things that it did wrong, or at least the things that they could have done that they didn't do, and maybe just a conversation and an exploration on what the game could have been. And I just want to say that this comes from a total admiration of the game. I think the game is absolutely stellar, and it has done so many things that are reminiscent of like the PlayStation 2 like golden era of video games. And I think it's a beautiful thing. I think it's almost nostalgic to play the game, even as someone who hasn't played an Armored Core game. They bring out the best when it comes to the aesthetics of that FromSoft can create, the vibe of the world, and then translating that to the enemies, and translating that to the music, and translating that to the total experience. And FromSoft has always been really good at that. So yeah, let's get into it, and let's talk about Armored Core 6. So the game looks like a dystopian, dark, atmospheric, technological landscape that is a perfect visual for like the story they're trying to tell about companies taking control of this like dystopian world, and taking control of planets and using planets for their natural resources. It's a perfect example of alignment between story, gameplay mechanics, and aesthetics. And I think having those three pillars being aligned makes any game an extremely memorable experience, because there's a cohesive direction that you could tell that the creators were going for from the very beginning, and they implemented it to multiple aspects of the game. They really nailed that in Armored Core 6. The game feels beautiful to play. It feels super slick, extremely anime, and in the best way, while also being readable. If you compare it to other Armored Core games, certain other Armored Core games were perhaps faster than this game, but this game was a really good balance of speed, anime slickness, while also being readable as much as it can. And I think it found a really, really good balance. The movement in general just feels very satisfying. And although it's a little unwieldy at times, it feels like purposefully so. The movement doesn't feel annoying, but it does feel like something that you need to master. And it does feel like you're moving around a heavy mech that is going to be difficult and take skill to maneuver in the exact way that you want, but you can learn to do it with putting a little bit of time and a little bit of skill, which is a perfect feeling. You don't want it to be extremely reactive like you're playing like a Call of Duty game, but you also want it to be, and I think they perfectly nailed that. Movement feels absolutely amazing, and not only does movement feel great, but using the wide array of weapons that you have in Armored Core 6 feels great as well. Using melee to punish a stun, just taking advantage of attack windows, and then getting in there with your dual-wield shotguns if that's what you're going for, or using just missile launchers. The sounds of everything feels absolutely perfect. We did have an issue of certain weapons feeling slightly underpowered, and we're going to talk about balance, but there definitely was an issue of specifically assault rifles and submachine guns feeling very underpowered. They were the only weapons that didn't feel satisfying. It's funny, literally today, a couple hours ago, a balance change came out, and they fixed it. So now assault rifles and submachine guns feel a lot better. Obviously, I've yet to play it with the new patch, But the fact that they did some substantial buffs to these weapons shows that they're willing to adjust the game in the right direction, which is great. The campaign is very cinematic. The PvP is also very fun. That being said, I want to talk about the flaws that the game has. There are some issues related to both PvP and the campaign that I think we should really discuss. So, how difficult is Armored Core 6? Well, that's a complicated question. The difficulty is as difficult as you want it to be. And that's actually a good thing. And I think it's a great thing to borrow from Souls games. A lot of Souls games, a lot of FromSoft games have this this philosophy where you can change your difficulty based on what weapons you choose to use and how you choose to play the game based on a couple of things. So in Dark Souls, in the Souls games, usually it's summoning. You get to summon allies to help you with bosses that you're struggling with, which is a way of reducing the difficulty, and it's a way of allowing newer players or players who are struggling to get help. It doesn't make the player feel bad for asking for help, but at the same time, it does remind the player that they used help, which is a very important point. The fact that it's a summon is a very memorable thing. So let's say you're playing Dark Souls 1. You beat Ornstein and Smo using a summon for the first time. You will remember that the fact that you struggled Ornstein and Smo and you had to summon for help. I think that is a good thing to have. That way it offers a challenge for repetitive playthroughs or New Game Plus playthroughs for them to like potentially choose, you know what, let me see if I could beat Ornstein and Smo without summoning for the boss or summoning my friend for a boss. It offers like a secondary layer of challenge. Those are absolutely great things to have. And in Armored Core 6, the optional difficulty is in place of your build. What build you choose to use is the optional difficulty. Usually the very heavy tanks with very heavy, strong weapons will make the game a lot easier than if you choose to go for a lightweight build that will require a lot more skill and a lot more input-heavy mechanics in order to thrive. What do I think about that? I think in the context of Armored Core 6, this is a bad thing because I personally think that Armored Core 6 could have benefited much more from having co-op. I think the game plays beautifully with co-op, and you could actually tell this from the campaign itself. In the campaign itself, there's a couple missions where you have help, and the game actually feels so much cooler when you have another AC helping you flying around, and the game plays perfectly fine with it. So because of that, I think the game could have had very well been suitable for having co-op and having players help you in your missions, and maybe you could have a little bit of health increase on the enemies to make up for it. I think that was a really big missed opportunity. And in place, because you have co-op, you could actually balance the game a lot better. An issue that you have with having optional difficulty in the form of builds makes it so that builds inherently can't be perfectly balanced because you need them to be unbalanced in order for players that are struggling to be able to thrive. I wish the game was a lot more balanced, and I wish that it was a true choice as to what build you wanted to use that didn't feel like it was skewed by what was more efficient, but rather what you think represented your playstyle the best. I don't mind bosses being easier to take out with specific types of builds, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking specifically about builds that are just stronger in general than other builds. I have a problem with that. There are bosses, for example, like the Juggernaut boss, that has a weak spot on top of him, and you're able to maintain hovering on top of him. You're able to do a lot more damage and a lot easier than having to face him head on. And I think that's kind of cool. I'm definitely okay with builds being having advantages and disadvantages against certain bosses, but I do think that it should overall be balanced. I think all builds should feel equally strong in general while being advantaged in different situations. And I feel like the game didn't quite nail that. I really hope that they balance those things with time. That being said, the fact that the game doesn't have optional difficulty if you do balance it kind of makes you wonder if it's even worth doing. You definitely want options for newer players who are going to struggle to play the game at a very high level to have the options of beating bosses with builds that are easier to play. So I don't know what exactly they would do to be able to have that. In a way, perhaps it's a problem they really can't fix. And because they don't have the co-op mechanic, they might have to leave the game unbalanced, which is a shame because the game being unbalanced negatively hinders PvP. And PvP is a huge issue in this game. Even though it's extremely fun, there's a lot of problems with PvP. And we're going to get into that. But before we talk about that, I'm going to quickly make one more point about the PvE. One of the flaws that the PvE has is the fact that the difficulty is very abrupt. I've seen a lot of people bring this up, and I totally agree with them. So what I mean by this is, oftentimes you'll have missions that are essentially a total walk in the park. A lot of very easy enemies to fight, and you'll basically be steamrolling through everything. Then you find like a mini boss, and then you actually have to struggle, right? And you end up dying a couple times. So that's the real challenge. And then that's where you actually end up experiencing most of the game, is just like fighting and refighting the same enemy that's difficult. That's actually a challenge. But then for the most part, it's completely unbalanced. So I think this is a very problematic aspect, because you'll fight the bosses, you'll fight the mini bosses, and those are the only fun parts of the game. But it was completely unnecessary. I think the game could have benefited so much more from spreading the difficulty a little bit. Those enemies, they should have buffed their damage, maybe even their health a little bit. I think the most important thing is that they should still be able to punish you with a good amount of damage if they hit you. Right now in the game, it's not like that, unfortunately. Unfortunately, if you're being hit by the fodder enemies, it just doesn't even matter. They're basically just tickling you. And I think that's a little bit, underwhelming. Like, it's not, I think it's a little cooler if they could actually do some damage to you. And then in turn, they could possibly nerf slightly some of the bosses. I think some of the bosses are actually slightly overtuned, not by much, but just by a little bit. And the only reason why people might disagree with this, in my opinion, is because there are builds that are obviously overpowered, and all the bosses are going to feel extremely easy if you use the right build against them. So obviously, like, if you nerf some of the strong builds and then you maybe slightly nerf some of the bosses, I think you'll have a really good balance where the bosses feel like slightly less overwhelming compared to the rest of the game. And then obviously you would buff the fodder enemies, like I mentioned. I don't know, that's something that I would do, but maybe, who knows, maybe you guys disagree with me on that. Alright, but now let's talk about the really big thing, the PvP. And I'm not just going to talk about specifically the PvP, but I'm going to talk about the mechanics of Armored Core and how they negatively impact the PvP. Okay, so a really big aspect of the PvP that I totally dislike, and I think was a total oversight, was at a mechanical level, the game doesn't have a way for the player to be precise with their aim. So what I mean by that is that the only options that you have to aim at people are lock-on types. So you either have the soft lock-on or the hard lock-on. The issue with the soft and the hard lock-on is, even though they're both different kinds of lock-ons that have different advantages in different situations, they both struggle at very far ranges in order to hit people who are moving. They can't really predict movement well in and of themselves. And while I know there is a movement prediction mechanic that is automatic in the game, that can be upgraded based on your firearm specialization and your chip, the game would have benefited a lot more to give the player the option to manually control the movement prediction system that the game has. I think this would have been added a lot more skill to the PvP potentially, and it also would have enabled the usage of long range weapons at a far range via using a movement prediction system. So the way I think the game could have implemented this extremely easily was by removing the manual aim system and just simply replacing it with a movement prediction system. So you basically stay locked onto the player when you're in this mode, and moving your long stick with the controller or moving your mouse with your mouse and keyboard would basically bias the bullets in a specific direction relative to what the lock-on center is. So if you move your long stick to the left while in this mode, it will start shooting the shots while still locked on. It will shoot it slightly to the left of the player. So if the player is moving to the left, or the enemy is moving to the left, it will actually still be hitting directly onto him. So and I think that would add a lot more skill to the game. But the game obviously didn't have this system, unfortunately. It would have really allowed snipers to be usable from different ranges. It would have allowed a lot more skill. You could actually use a lot of projectile weapons at range viably if they had a system like this. But unfortunately, if you want to actually predict people's movements, the only option that you have is the manual aim in the game, which is unfortunately very underwhelming. While it is good in certain situations, for the most part, any beam weapons or any weapons that are that are very precise and don't do big explosions, are just not that good with the manual aim because you have to be way too precise that to an unreasonable level. And maybe potentially a mouse and keyboard player could maybe do something with it, but there's absolutely no chance that a controller player is going to be able to use manual aim for very precise weapons. It just wouldn't really work. And unless you have a system like the one I mentioned, I don't think it could ever happen. I think it was a big oversight, and I think the game could have benefited a lot from that. But that's just a critique that is kind of at death's door because there's not much you could do with it right now. The game already came out. In a system like this, FromSoft has no precedence in ever adding something so complex to a game that has already came out. So the best we could talk about is some balance changes and critiques when it comes to actually actionable advice for the game. There's an issue with self-expression versus meta when it comes specifically to the PvP of the game, and arguably a little bit for the PvE as well. This game shines the most when the player has a lot of freedom to make whatever build they want and reasonably be able to use their build in different situations. Basically, in my opinion, the closer the game gets to a point that players could make their build based on whatever they want to use at a fun level rather than at a meta level, the better the game is going to be. You have to have balance in order for that to happen. But unfortunately, in the current state of the game, there are some weapons and armors that are just superior in the vast majority of situations. For example, the most popular weapons right now are the stun pistols, the Zimmermans, which are the shotguns, and then that as well as a couple of things like the coral shields. I've been seeing some things about coral generators are very strong. Generally speaking, armor pieces that have a lot of stability defense are really incentivized because stability as a mechanic in this game is very overpowering for the game, especially in PvP and especially against bosses, which are the biggest challenges in the game. Even though it's a very fun mechanic, don't get me wrong, I think it's just it has a little too much emphasis on how much damage is done throughout the fight. Just honestly lowering the damage multiplier would be good enough, and maybe just lowering the stun on some weapons. Maybe you could even have some weapons do a lot of stun damage but make them a little bit harder to use. But maybe, for example, like the melee weapons, I don't mind the melee weapons doing a lot of stun damage because they actually require skill to hit. So it's fair to say that most builds that are viable consist of a way to stun players efficiently and then a way of punishing the stagger efficiently as well, usually with a high damage or high DPS option that is going to be able to thrive while someone is stunned. There are exceptions to this though. For example, there is the missile build strategy, which is just you try to run as many missiles as you can while shooting as many missiles as you can while running away as much as you can. And then you try to just basically deal as damage to them slowly using your missiles, which will basically do guaranteed damage very slowly because they have tracking. The issue, in my opinion, that is like the fundamental aspect of this, there is a big imbalance between light and heavy builds. So generally speaking, light builds are just very underpowered compared to heavy builds. Heavy builds tend to have the option of carrying stronger weapons that are heavier and more armor, which gives them more stability defense and more health in general. And I think those things are not a worthy trade-off in the game currently for a little bit of speed. Generally speaking, speed is just not that efficient. Like a little bit of speed is not going to make up for all the advantages that the heavy builds have. And I think the game really needs to give more passive bonuses to being lighter weight. I would increase the difference of speed between the heavy and the light mechs, and I would personally maybe even increase some of the quick boost ability of the lighter mechs. And I think you'd get a little bit closer to a parity and a little bit of fairness between light and heavy builds if you did that. I also think the stagger weapons need to be probably nerfed, and I think the importance of stagger probably needs to be lowered. In my opinion, they should maybe consider lowering the damage multiplier for PvP that stagger has. That way there isn't a huge emphasis on staggering, but it's still something that is a useful mechanic, but it's not going to be like the end-all be-all of the game. You could actually have builds that are more based on consistent damage rather than stun. The only builds that really fall into this category right now are the very overpowered missile builds. You could do a lot of things to nerf missiles. arguably you could nerf missiles themselves, but I think a better option would be to somehow nerf having multiple missiles together. And I think the best way to do this, there's just one idea, but there's probably a lot of ideas, but maybe one idea could be that missiles in themselves, like tracking missiles, anything that has tracking, actually takes away a little bit of your max stamina or your max energy capacity. And what that would do is make it so that these missile builds struggle a little bit more to run away, because if they're running 4 missiles, if they have my change, essentially it'd be actually hindering their max stamina a lot, and it would allow people to catch up to them a lot better. So they would have to be a lot more precise with their movement in order to be able to successfully be able to use a build like this. And it would kind of become a lot more of a meme build rather than something that's actually scary viable. Unfortunately, when you have a build that is just extremely annoying to play against and just very strong in the right hands, you just kind of need to nerf it. Even if that means that you're kind of nerfing it a little bit too much, it's better to have the missile builds be nerfed to the ground than be slightly good. Like, in my opinion, you want to just make sure that annoying builds are like kind of relegated to memes that are kind of only good against noobs. But I think once you know what you're doing and you're playing efficiently against it, that they should really struggle, and like there should be no excuse for them winning when people are playing efficiently against them. And I think that builds like that are just bad for the game for them to be too strong. The good news is, though, there's been recent balance changes that came out that buffed assault rifles and submachine guns, and those balance changes I have a lot of really good opinions about. It's a great direction for the game. Submachine guns and assault rifles were extremely weak, and I'm very happy that they're buffing them. Now it feels like you could actually, at least even in the PvE, play very viably with them. Yeah, I'm excited for the trajectory of the game. I will say this, I was very pessimistic about the skill expression of Armored Core, but honestly, the more I've seen of the PvP, the more I've been positively impressed with the potential that the game has. The manual prediction system that I was talking to you about, when I realized the game failed to have that, and when I realized that the game was just all lock on and had nothing else, and had no way of predicting players' movements, I was very disappointed with the game when it first came out. Honestly, to me, it felt like a very obvious decision to make, because I honestly didn't understand why they didn't do it. It felt very obvious to me to have something like that. But I was very worried about the skill expression. I was very worried that the game would just basically die very soon, and that there wouldn't be too much to explore, because just basically I was expecting shotgun builds to just completely dominate. And to a certain extent, I was right. Shotgun builds, the Zimmerman builds are very strong. So I was definitely right about that to a certain extent. But honestly, the more I look at the game, I do see so many interesting builds. I do see a lot of interesting melee builds that focus on punishing people's mistakes. I do see a lot of interesting stuff happening now with shields. People are really investigating now with shields and seeing the potential that shields have. I see a lot of people looking at the potential that even long range rifles have. There's a lot to explore with this game, and tons of things that are yet to be discovered. So I'm honestly very impressed with Armored Core 6, and I can't wait to see what happens with the game. I think once they balance out the game even more, I think the game is going to be an absolute banger, and I really can't wait. So yeah, let me know what you guys think about Armored Core 6, and tell me your opinions about the game in the comments below. Leave a like and subscribe if you want more game design discussion and critique in this casual format. And I will be actually doing more formalized videos coming up, kind of like Joseph Anderson and stuff like that kind of format will be coming out soon. So yeah, stay tuned guys, and peace out. Take care guys.